Welcome to The Indigenous Approach, a podcast where we examine the role of the nation's premier partnership force across the competition continuum, from cooperation to conflict and everything in between. In this episode, Colonel Eric Kreitz, the 1st Special Forces Command Director of Information Warfare, Dr. Richard Harknett, one of the world's leading cybersecurity experts, and Major Jay Kosturko, an electronic warfare officer, discuss integrating cyber capabilities and how our people should think about the cyber domain.
Hi everyone, I'm Colonel Eric Kreitz, the Director of Information Warfare at 1st Special Forces Command. This Indigenous Approach episode is a mental primer ahead of our command's Innovation Symposium that we're hosting in March. The symposium is meant to get members of our command focused on integrating cyber capabilities, and today's episode is meant to frame how we want our people thinking about the cyber domain. To do that, I have the distinct pleasure of sitting down with two professionals from different ends of the cyberspace spectrum. Representing the strategic and policy perspective is Dr. Richard Harknett, Professor and Department Head of the Political Science Department at the University of Cincinnati, and he's the co-director of the Ohio Cyber Range Institute and chair of the University Center for Cyber Strategy and Policy. Previously, he served as a Fulbright Scholar in Cyber Studies at Oxford University and as the inaugural Scholar in Residence at U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency. Dr. Harknett, welcome. It's a great honor to have you sit down with us today.
It's terrific to be here. Thank you so much.
And representing the tactical end of the spectrum, we have Army Major Jay Kosturko. Jay is an electronic warfare officer and is the staff officer spearheading our efforts to further develop our tactical cyber infrastructure. Jay, thank you for the work you're doing on behalf of the command, and welcome to the show today.
Thanks, sir. Glad to be here.
Dr. Harknett, I'd like to start today's conversation with you. We've been thinking about cyber strategy and cyber policy for a long time. What are some of the main points that you want people to know about the cyber domain?
So let's start off with the idea that it's global and interconnected. And everybody's heard that, right? Almost every cyber speech, cyber policy document starts off with something like that, right? It's global and it's interconnected. But what typically follows in those policy documents or speeches is a lot of talk that's anchored on segmentation. Right, that actually doesn't think through the implications of what does it mean to be operating in an interconnected space that is at global scale. And so the structure of this space is the first thing I think we want people to think through. Right? To be interconnected is to establish condition of constant contact. And it's constant contact, not simply with your adversary, but because this is global and interconnected, right? You are interconnected with the adversary, the ally, the private sector, all the way down to the individual level. And so that inability to segment, which is our normal way of thinking about the terrestrial space, right? Whether we're on air, land, or sea, that's not the organizing structure in which we are competing and potentially fighting if we're thinking about cyberspace. And so we'll talk, I think, a bit more in the podcast later about the implications of this strategic environment. But what I'm going to suggest is that it's got its own distinctive strategic dynamic, and that is one of initiative persistence. And that if you don't have the initiative, you will be punished in this space. And if you do, you've got the chance of being rewarded. So that's the first thing I'd want people to focus on. And then the second is the nature of this structure, right, of this strategic environment. And the nature of it is that it is strategic below the level of warfare, right? So we have tended to think along that continuum of cooperation, competition, and conflict, that where the real strategic action takes place is in conflict. That's where relative power, that's where national sources of power lie. right? And that's when they become at risk, is when we actually enter into that conflict space. And what I would argue is that we now have to think about the competition space as truly strategic. That is, that there are cumulative gains to be made in such a way that I can shift relative power on a significant scale. And so cyberspace, therefore, opens up a new seam in great power competition, one in which we can achieve ends that heretofore were only achieved through conflict. And now we can do it short of that. Why is that salient for the United States? Is because most of our adversaries, particularly in the great power competition space, don't want to go to war with us, right? And the DoD 2018 cyber strategy acknowledged that. But the reason why we're seeing all the activity that we're seeing in cyberspace and why it's become so salient at the strategic level is because they're making the choice to compete with us at that, with those gains as their expectation and intent, while not actually tripping the threshold in which conflict, where our comparative advantages lie, would be engaged. So let's think about and talk about, when I think about this at the national strategy level, I think about a structure of a strategic environment. If we're going to call it global and interconnected, then we need to actually understand the implications of that. And then the nature of this space is that this isn't nuisance space. This isn't traditional competition space. This is actually a strategic venue, just as significant for our national sources of power as the conflict space has been historically.
Thanks for that, Richard. I did have a quick question for you to follow up on some of your points. How do you see escalation in that competition? We've had discussions here at the command about one of the worst things that we can do is not respond, and that in fact will cause further escalation. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I gave a briefing about now 4 years ago. Time's flies, when we started to think through a new doctrine in this space. And I argued that the most escalatory thing the United States had done in the last decade was not react, right? That by staying in a deterrence posture in which we were reactive and then never actually reacting, that we had actually increased the opportunity space for our adversaries. And, I don't think anybody would argue that empirically we haven't seen an increase in scale, scope, and speed of activity among our adversaries over the last 10 years. So what's interesting, Eric, about this, and we can potentially get more into this, particularly Jay's thoughts about this, is those of us that are focused on cyber persistence argue that this is not, in fact, a coercive space below the threshold. So when we think about cyber as an enabling, then we think coercion, right? And we're not going to be able to do coercion without cyber as a component. But now there's this other element. And we argue that this is more of an exploitation space than a coercion space. And so therefore, old models of escalation are actually getting it wrong, right? That this is an interaction space, and that, look, the empirical record supports this. If you look at all of the activity that's going on, we do not see escalatory trends, right? We don't see escalatory dynamics. Why? Because we don't actually see coercion. What we see is direct efforts to change the conditions of security on the ground. The ground being a virtual scape, right? So the changing of both the means by which I traverse cyberspace, and this is the interesting thing too as well, right, is that the means to traverse and the terrain in which you're traversing are one and the same thing. It's the same code, right? And it's serving different purposes, right? And so in that space, all of the activity that we're seeing below the threshold of what would be a armed attack equivalence is in fact a resetting of the conditions of security and insecurity. It's not about coercion. I'm not trying to shape your decision calculus. I'm going and changing the conditions on the ground. Solar winds change the conditions, right, in which we are operating. I'm not worrying about your decision calculus, right? I'm just going actually and doing that. So we can talk more about that, but I think that's really an important kind of shift in our thinking that has to occur from legacy thinking about coercion, deterrence, and escalation.
Rich, one more question for you. Do you think that our national strategy, national policies are enabling us to be able to do what we need to do in competition?
So I think we've made some very significant shifts in the last few years. I think 2017, 2018 were quite significant in pivoting to where I think we need to be going. So it started at the national security strategy level, in which we anchored the main threat moving from violent extremism to great power competition. But in that NSS, it explicitly notes that our adversaries are trying to challenge us in the space below war, right? And leveraging cyberspace for that. And so then if you look at the National Defense Strategy published in early 2018, it picked up on that, right? And it gave a much more explicit, in the global operating model, was much more explicit about the role of DoD in competition, and that cyber was a core area for that. And then the 2018 DoD cyber strategy document made this explicit. So on page 4 of that document, if you don't want to read anything else, just read page 4, right? It argues that why we need to persistently engage is because, in fact, our adversaries are deterred from going to war with us. So they are now moving into this space to challenge us economically through intellectual property theft and things of this nature, through challenging democratic principles and institutional legitimacy, and the list goes on, right? And then if you, the logical progression of that was U.S. Cyber Command adopting the explicit doctrine of persistent engagement. That combination of pivot, Eric, I think is quite significant. We're a big entity, the USG and the US military. So that shift is not comprehensive. And there is still segments, large segments of USG that have not pivoted toward this notion of being a persistent force. And that's not just a military concept, right? That is, how do we orient ourselves in DHS, alignment with private sector, and at the engaged citizenry level. But I think we're on the right track. And there seems to be reinforcement of that movement, at least my early take as an outsider looking at the Biden administration's appointments in key positions. These are people who are familiar with the pivot towards a more persistent operational context and this notion of being engaged persistently. So I think we're heading in the right direction. My hope, Eric, is this is not something the United States came up with. This is what our adversaries have been doing. And so my hope is that in certain places around the world, the adversaries are going, damn it, they finally figured it out. And that we're going to make life a lot more complicated for them moving forward.
Thanks, Rich. Over to you now, Jay. I'm curious what you think about Dr. Harknett's responses. Somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about cyberspace at the tactical level, what resonates with you?
So I think the force has figured out that we're behind on tactical cyber. When I take a look at the capabilities that Russia brought to the Ukraine in 2014, well-integrated effects in support of tactical objectives, my first thought is that I don't think there is anything that we couldn't do on a technical level, but I don't think that we could pull off that sort of operation holistically today. And the gap isn't due to a lack of money or talented people or the lack of a technical tool, but because of different risk tolerance and a different degree of investment in building out our force. So while we focused for the last 20 years on the global war on terror, our competitors have spent years examining and experimenting to gain asynchronous advantage in information warfare. And they were willing to take experimental risks and invest and find out what works. And so they were experimenting really kind of on two levels, experimenting on the technique level, and then also experimenting really kind of on the international level, trying to figure out how far they could go without prompting a response. The interesting thing about Ukraine is it really did not prompt a major response from the US, or at least not a public one that I'm aware of. I think they were willing to take those experimental risks, and so they've gotten ahead of us. I think we could do the same, but we need to begin by adopting a different mindset, particularly about risk. So similar to mission command, we have to be able to push disciplined initiative out to the edge and be willing to accept the risk that not every experiment will work on the first try. And we need to understand that that's not irresponsible. That's realistic. That's how we learn as individuals and as a force. I think it's how we're going to win and close that gap. I think we're at a moment of opportunity. We spent years arguing for the need for cyber support tactical operations, and I think that argument's been won. We've made the case that we need to be able to do digital force protection at the edge, and that we need to be the ones doing that. We need to be able to organically support our own operations, and we also need to be able to integrate with enterprise-level cyber support. One, leveraging the access and placement that SOF naturally achieves. And we can do that both in support of our operations, bringing their effects to bear, and also because we have that placement and access, I think we can open doors for them that they couldn't open for themselves. Both Cybercom and SOCOM have realized that SOF and cyber together is like chocolate and peanut butter. We are natural complements to the other one's capabilities. We're not competitors, and that is a very healthy change. I say that it's a moment of opportunity because I think we still have to build it. We have a lot of the pieces required. We've got good understanding of the mission, good understanding of technology. We've got open opportunities for cross-training, and we've got a community of experts that are ready to work. What we need at this point is better mid-level understanding of the different risk calculus that Dr. Harknett alluded to. And we also need a committed investment of people, time, and money to build it. So I like to use the allegory of a birthday party magician. If you are an invited guest at a children's birthday party and a magician is there to entertain, that magician is going to do tricks that look like magic. And those tricks are going to be fast, they're going to be entertaining, and they're going to be free, at least to the guest. But if what you're trying to do is hire a staff magician, you've got to select them, you've got to hire them, you've got to pay them, you've got to give them the equipment they need, you've got to give them the training time that they need to perfect their craft. And you're doing that all in a pursuit of a certain number of hours of effects that they bring to bear. So it's a different level of investment that we need to bring. Again, I think the big things that we need to look for in the future are a change in our level of risk tolerance. Kind of as Dr. Harknett alluded to, we need to be willing to push those boundaries of competition short of conflict. And the other thing is we need to be very serious about the investment we're going to bring.
Now, as a command that has forces operating around the globe in 70 countries, what do those guys need to know about the cyber domain?
So several things. To begin with, the threat is real. So deploying soldiers need to understand that competitors are collecting on their digital exhaust even before they deploy. And they need to be serious about their force protection. I would liken it to medics. On most of our missions, we focus more on doing things by, with, and through. And we hope not to get injured in those missions, but we always take a medic on the mission. The new reality today is that a soldier is vastly more likely to suffer harm in cyberspace than they are to be physically injured. So deploying without a good cyber defense plan makes about as much sense, or I would say even less sense, than deploying without body armor or a medic. I'll add that we choose how we will invest in this domain. We don't choose how our adversaries will invest or get to wish that away. So they've already invested and they've proven their capabilities to disrupt operations. The other caveat that I would put to that is, pivoting off of Dr. Harknett's comment about global reach, is we need to understand that our threat surface includes non-combatants. Our threat surface includes our family, our loved ones, the kind of our CONUS-based footprint as well. And we need to be preaching to our family that digital force protection includes them as well. Particularly for soldiers when we're deployed, that global interconnection that he referred to means that a soldier with bad digital hygiene could potentially expose their families to risk. Next thing I'd want them to know is the risk tolerance for continuous engagement. We don't have an authorities gap. We don't have a technical gap. We have a risk tolerance gap. And this is where I think, again, that mission command approach of pushing discipline initiative down to the edge and allowing empowered soldiers to figure out the techniques that work and figuring out the tactics that work is the right approach. The other thing I'd want soldiers to know is that the tools are already there. I've never had a soldier ask me for something that sounded more like science fiction than science. Most of the tools that they ask for already exist. I know leaders at the national level are concerned about high equity tools. I call these $1 million malware. Leaders are concerned about what might be revealed if we use these tools or that they could somehow be used against us. But at the tactical level, what we're focusing on is what I would term low equity tools. The phrase I use is hardware from Amazon, software from GitLab, and techniques that could be learned on YouTube. Our actions are still going to need to be deconflicted, but I don't think we're struggling greatly for tools. The final thing I would want people to know is that we have to invest in organic capability. We have a great partnership with Cybercom and the Cyber Center of Excellence. But the difference between enterprise and soft peculiar cyber isn't capability, it's timing and tempo and the degree of integration. And so that is something where I think what Cybercom brings to the fight is great, but they work theater and national level problems. If we need digital force protection at the edge, we have to invest in that capability themselves. Cybercom is not going to be able to do that for an ODA.
Great, thank you very much, Jay. Rich, back over to you. Our commanding general, General Brennan, has been full speed ahead in supporting Jay and his initiatives and enabling cyber at the tactical level for our command. However, outside of our command, there seem to be some pockets of hesitation when it comes to that consistent cyber engagement in competition at the national level. What challenges do you see from your seat, and how can we overcome those challenges when it comes to ensuring that our decision makers are educated and know what tactical cyber really is? Is it a mindset change, or is it an authorities or policy change?
All three. And I'll walk through all three. But if I could build off of what Jay said, and I agree with everything he just laid out. I just want to amplify, if you don't mind, two things that he pointed to, and that'll get me to answering your question. I really want to emphasize this push to the edge component of this, because that is where we are absolutely better than our adversaries, right? We operate at an edge. We're comfortable. We're operating at the edge. That is our culture, right? Across the U.S. military versus authoritarian states that the technology is allowing you to become much more effective around the edge, but they have hesitancy in centralized and authoritarian states, right? So there's a limit to how far they're going to go, right? And I think that's one of our comparative advantages, is to actually double down on our ability to get better at pushing things to the edge. Jay was absolutely right that a lot of what our adversaries achieved over the last decade was experimental, but they learned from those experiments, right? And they were then able to become more strategic in implementing the thinking through the potentiality of those experiments, right? So I think while they've been in an experimental mode, it's also positioned them to become much more intentional at the strategic level as well. And then this notion of a risk tolerance gap, I'd go one step further than Jay. We've had a risk definition gap, right? So I think we've not defined risk appropriately. So back to your point earlier, Eric, about being concerned of escalation into the conflict space, right? When empirically that's not happening. So, and I think Jay said it, we put restrictions on ourselves, right? It's not from being contested or contained by our adversaries, right? A lot of this has been self-induced, right? It's choice on our part. But I think that choice comes from actually a definitional problem of what risk is. So if you've misdefined the risk, then, and you're also risk averse, and that's what I take from Jay's notion of risk tolerance, then boy, the gap between what your adversaries are willing to do and what we're willing to do is huge, right? And so what is that risk definition gap? Again, is to recognize that while we have to prepare for cyber as enabler, right, for the war fight and be extremely effective at that, we also have to go to where our adversaries have gone, right, and become more effective at this strategic competition, not competition in the traditional sense of espionage for espionage sake or theft and shaping, right? This is about changing the conditions. I know that the strategic doctrine document for that sort of sets the tone, right? To be first to observe, first to influence, and first to compete, talks about setting the conditions to win. And that's in the conflict space, right? And what I would add to that, to what Jay's saying in the cyber space, is that you need to set the conditions to advance national interests, right? Because national interests are at stake in the competition space. And you have to go about setting those conditions there as well, right? So the same mindset that we use in the conflict space, I think has to be applied here. And so to your question about mindset change, authorities change, policies change, I think Jay's right? At the technical level, we're developing the capabilities. Authorities have changed, right? So I think importantly, under the last administration, the changes moving away from PBD 20 was a significant authorities change. And then recognizing that cyber is traditional military operations or affairs was also a really important congressional designation with regard to authorities. So the mindset change, I think, Eric, comes to this notion that in a environment of constant action, our strategy cannot be based on a approach whose measure of success is the absence of action. Deterrence as a central strategic construct, right? The measure of being successful when you are trying to deter somebody is the absence of their action, right? But if we acknowledge and understand cyberspace, both in and through, to be a persistent space of constant action, then we need to have a different strategic orientation, right? Because success is not coming from the absence of action. Success is coming from persistence and persistent action, right? And being able to anticipate the exploitation of vulnerability before those vulnerabilities are exploited, and being able to anticipate how we can exploit the vulnerabilities of the other side. And that gets to the nature of this space, that it is a space of inherent vulnerability. Right? And therefore, why the dominant action that we see taking place is exploitation of vulnerability. The SOF is perfectly aligned, right, for this space. And I think, you know, we get into more details about that, but I don't think, I think it's SOF taking the logical extension of where it has been and moving it into a fully interconnected global space, which it has always thought about, right, itself as being in your podcast, indigenous, right? But to really take it down to that depth that you are in constant contact. We don't have the segmentation that we typically assume that we can try to impose into the strategic give and take, right? And down to the tactical and operational level. So how do we move forward? We have to recognize that if we do not persist and do not have the capacity to change the conditions of security in our favor and insecurity for our adversaries, then we are ceding the initiative. And to cede initiative in cyberspace is ultimately to lose. And that to me is the fundamental mindset change. And that becomes the most important thing. I'll say one last thing real quick, Eric, right? Is that previously, the way we've been approaching this space is we've looked at the authorities and said, who can do what? And then went to the organizations that could do what, and then said, okay, do this, right? And then tried to align that with national interest. And that's not how you engage in strategic thinking, right? You decide what do you want to do first. You figure out the organization that you need to do it. And then the last thing you do is authorize it to do that, right? And so the mindset shift, which then empowers us to think strategically about this space differently, to me, is the most important, because then everything else should follow from that. And I think we're moving in the right direction. And I think what you all have been doing and thinking and taking on the role, and I agree with Jay about the complementarity. I don't know about the Reese's Cup thing, but the complementarity of what we've got across the U.S. military. Again, we've got to start to leverage that more, right? You cannot solve interconnectedness through segmentation. You solve it through synergy. And I think that's part of your own ethos, right? And why I think SOF can be a major, major player in advancing U.S. security in cyberspace, because it's all about finding those synergy points rather than the segmentation points.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rich. That's I do want to hit on a couple of your points. I think you hit the nail on the head, especially when it comes to this command. We see that as part of our value proposition is operating at the edge in that persistent engagement, and then selecting people for those qualities that we look for in SOF operators of creativity, looking for vulnerabilities, and that type of thing. As part of that RSOF network, we do take a look at where do we find the adversary's vulnerabilities, and then how do we get that information back and synthesize it so that we can do something about it, either on the ground in a decentralized manner or back here centrally, so that we can get ahead of our adversaries. Jay, you and I have worked through a couple barriers within our own processes and trying to get what you need when it comes to tactical cyber established. What kind of barriers are you focused on moving forward?
I wanted to start with just kind of pivoting off of something that Dr. Harknett said. When I think continuous engagement, I think of a boxer or a wrestler in the ring. If I don't want to get punched, I could back away, in which case my adversary is going to advance. I could block, in which case he's just going to wait for an opening. But if I really want to protect myself from getting hit, I need to be jabbing, and those jabs, one, should keep my adversary off balance, Two, they're kind of my sensors. I'm gonna find out where he's got openings and weaknesses. So what I'm really trying to do is stay engaged and keep myself from getting hit. But what I'm also finding out is where is he really weak. When I need to engage decisively now, because of those jabs, I know where I can hit the hardest for the greatest effect. When I think of obstacles, to be honest, sir, I don't really see authorities as an obstacle anymore. One, we have good policy now that I find pretty enabling. And we also have good command relationships up to the national level. So frankly, if we needed additional authorities and did have an authorities gap, I think we could ask for what we needed and reasonably expect to get what we needed. What we do need is better leader understanding of the authorities that we have now and better risk tolerance. So what I think we need to do is to train as if the authorities were already granted. If a unit hasn't been ordered to deploy, they won't. But if they're not going to the rifle range, they won't be prepared when they're asked to deploy. And I think we do have an obstacle with leader education and risk tolerance that we need to overcome. The biggest obstacle that I work on a daily basis is manning and resourcing. So acknowledging that we work in a resource constrained environment. But again, we need to be realistic about the risks that we're likely to face. And we need to resource appropriately. And so this can come in the form of time on a training calendar. We have a lot of competing requirements there, and so we need to look at what do we need to do to make sure that we're protected in digital space, and also where can we see opportunities and be prepared for that. It may be that we need to take people out of a more conventional role and align them to a more cyber specific role within our own formations, and that comes at a bit of a cost. But really, I think getting back to that magic analogy that I used earlier, we need to recognize that cyber isn't magic; it's work, and it takes a certain amount of resources and a certain amount of time and focus. What we have right now in the command is a lot of very talented people that are very passionate, and a lot of them are self-taught. And so when these people give a demonstration, again, what you're seeing is an effect that's delivered quickly. What sometimes is not obvious is the amount of time and personal energy that person has developed to hone their own skills, to purchase their own resources and whatnot. And so we have to align our resources where our biggest opportunities and threats are.
And so pivoting here a bit over to innovation, our command and our commanding general has made it clear that he wants to prioritize innovation over modernization. Modernization being updating the things that we have to make them better, but innovation is making that leap into something new that our adversaries would have to counter, and therefore we create that dilemma for our adversaries. Jay, I'll ask you, how do you view innovation at the tactical level?
So one of the biggest examples that I want to use as a model for innovation is the Rhino system that was put on the front of our Humvees back in the early 2000s. We knew we were having a problem with IEDs, and specifically those that were triggered through the heat bloom of the engine. The adversaries would put a passive infrared sensor that would trip when the Humvee drove by, and they would aim their explosively formed projectiles at the body of the Humvee. And so we all knew the problem, and we all knew it was serious, but nobody knew how to solve it until a soldier in a motor pool figured out that he could put a boom on the front of a Humvee and put a heat surface on the front of that boom, and that would cause the passive infrared sensor and the EFP to trip early. So to do that, you had to have disciplined initiative. You had to have empowerment down to that low level. Everyone knew that the problem was there, and that soldier who figured that out had the resources to experiment a little bit. So we have to resource down to that level. We have to understand also that you're going to get some duplication of effort. So you might have multiple teams or multiple soldiers, working on the same basic problem, but experimenting in very different directions. And not all of those experiments are going to pan out. So when we think of a a conventional resourcing model. We like to avoid duplication. We want to get a very well-defined requirement, and we want to get a centralized effort, and we build it, and it might be a years-long process, and then we might find out that we got it mostly right and it needs to change. What we need to move towards is a model where the discipline initiative and the resources are pushed down, that duplicate efforts are welcomed and encouraged. And then we also accept that some of those efforts won't work out, but we're prepared to rapidly surge on the ones that don't, or the ones that do work out rather. So again, I think that gets back to that theme of risk acceptance and risk tolerance, and being able to aggressively push up to the edge.
Thanks, Jay. Rich, how do you see that at the national level?
So I like the fact that that General Brennan, it talks about innovation as a leap, right? Because a lot of people talk about innovating, but what they're talking about is incremental change, right? So a leap, right, is what innovation is about. And I think it's going to take an integrated whole of nation plus approach for us to make the leap that we need to make in having the capabilities and the operational capacity to keep the tempo that we need in strategic competition, right? So that persistent engagement actually leads to changing conditions in our favor relative to our adversaries. That innovation is something that we do not necessarily control a huge portion of, at least at the technical level, right? So that private sector, we've been talking about a private-public partnership for 25 years. I'll be honest, I was part of a team that worked on that back in the 90s, and critical infrastructure protection and all that kind of good stuff. And I'll tell you that I've been arguing for a while that we've got to move away from a partnership model and move to an alignment model. And we have to recognize that the private sector wakes up in the morning with a different interest than the national security state. It's just as simple as that, right? Profit making and security making are not necessarily the same two things, and that's okay, right? And so the question is, how do we align those two interests to have outcomes that produce more enhanced security for the United States and its allies? And so the innovation stream has to become much more aligned. The feedback loop from threat identification to threat mitigation, and then building the capabilities and operational capacity to deal with those just has to get better. And that's an organizational standpoint. I agree with Jay, it's not an authority standpoint. We make way too much, I think, of our authorities gaps at times. Times they matter, but a lot of it, this is organizational culture, which has a heck of a lot longer legacy than anything else, right? But look, if we go and look at if I said to you, hey, for forward deployed troops, US troops around the world, you guys really got to be on the lookout for fitness companies based in San Francisco. Like, they're going to pose a threat to you guys, right? I mean, you'd be walking me out of the room. Or like, what the heck are you guys, what are you talking about, right? But when Strava, right, this little Fitbit company posts global heat maps of our soldiers running around in, what they thought was really cool. It's like, hey, look, we're in the dark places of the world, right? Not a single person in that room said, I wonder if those are forward deployed US forces, right? They just thought that was a really cool marketing moment, right? Which is fine for them to think about. But that had a level of exposure that, the Soviet Union, with all of its intelligence operations, was not able to get that kind of fidelity, right, for 70 years, right? And you've got this small fitness company being able to put that kind of information up in a global, interconnected space, right? So we have to innovate when we think capabilities down to the tactical level. What Jay's talking about, we've got to bring as many minds and brains and eyes to this problem. And so, yes, we have to set up mechanisms that allow the edge to talk back up the chain, right? And that the chain actually reacts to the edge, right? And that's great. But I would argue that you have to do that in a multi-vector way. So we have to become better with the private sector in terms of aligning where they're going and where we need them to be conscious of what we do and operate as a U.S. security enterprise, and make sure that they're not complicating that pursuit, which ultimately redounds on them and allows them to make the profit that they make, because we're producing a secure environment for them to make that profit, right? So I think innovation and capabilities has to open up in terms of our understanding of who's actually influencing the capability space, how much and how little influence we have in cyber-based technologies that we have to react to. And then, oh, by the way, our adversaries have easy access to this stuff too, right? And so therefore, that's an additional vector that we become our own potentially worst enemy. When I think of AI, and leading world powers, I'd put China in the lead right now, because with artificial intelligence, the math is there. We're getting there on the supercomputers. It's all about the data that you're feeding these machines. And the advantage China has is they can get down to the behavioral level of sucking up every bit of information of their populace, because they don't have the civil liberties restrictions that we do. I think the US is pretty good in developing these capabilities, but I place it third right now in the world with regard to AI capabilities. And number 2 on that list is Alphabet, right? And so if you buy into that, just let me run with that for a second, right? I know how to think about China as a strategic actor and its ability to innovate and the likely route that it's going to take to innovation. And I know how to think about the United States as a strategic actor. How do I think about Alphabet as a strategic actor? And where does that impact my approach to innovation on capabilities, operations, tactics, et cetera? I once asked Eric Schmidt that direct question, right? And he didn't really have an answer that he wanted to give me, right? He argued that the U.S. is, or Alphabet is, follows U.S. law. Point granted. But U.S. law in this space is very limited, right? It's not restrictive at all. So I still don't know how to think about that private sector capacity as having strategic effect. But it is certainly impacting the strategic environment. It's in fact laying that environment, that terrain out in front of me. And it's also laying the new means in which the leap that General Brennan's talking about, that leap is going to be affected as much by Alphabet as China and our other traditional strategic competitors. That, to me, requires a big leap in mindset to get us to wrap our heads around the challenge that we're going to face with cyberspace moving forward.
Rich, thanks for your thoughts on that. Before we wrap it up, I'd like to ask each of you one last question. For people who may not spend a whole lot of time thinking about cyberspace but want to get caught up, what resources can you point them to? Jay, I'll go over to you first.
Number one resource that I would look at is Darknet Diaries by NPR. It's a very good non-technical language explanation of a lot of technical aspects of cybersecurity. They explore nation-state hacking. They explore some criminal elements, even some cultural issues that affect cybersecurity. It's a very I think they do it once every 2 weeks, and it's a very engaging listen. For regular news, I go to the CyberWire, which does a number of different podcasts, including one called Human Hacking, focusing on the social engineering aspects of cybersecurity. and they're all very well done. For technical development, what I tell people that are aspiring in the field is get very good at the fundamentals and then start solving interesting problems. So there's a number of technical resources out there, and I'll list some of them below to get studied up on the fundamentals of cybersecurity. What I would say at the outset is it's easier to get started than you think. If you can survive high school Spanish and high school algebra, you should be able to get through a good high school level course in Python with no challenge. When it gets into challenges, there's a couple ones that jump out. One is Over the Wire, which is a set of online challenges, mostly designed to teach skills. And then there's a couple that are capture the flag type events. One is Hack the Box, which is online intentionally vulnerable VMs that are put out there for people to challenge. Another one is the All Army Capture the Flag event that's typically run by the Army Cyber Institute. They leave that up during the year, and so for military members that are interested in doing that, one, they have a website that I'll post below, and then two, we have the ability to run unit level scoreboards, and it's a very, very well produced event. So that would be where I would get folks started, sir.
Thanks, Jay. Rich, over to you. What resources can you point folks to? And I'll give you the last word as well.
Well, thanks, Colonel. The Major just gave a great list, and I wound up agreeing with him like this whole time. So that was a great list. So I would encourage everybody to go down that. So I'll just add two on the strategy policy side. You know, obviously I'm quite biased towards the doctrine of persistent engagement, but if you want to get sort of caught up on that, the most accessible article, it was actually written or published in August 2020 in Foreign Affairs by General Nakasone, called Competing in Cyberspace. So it's a short piece that I think gets right to the heart of this sort of new strategic mindset. And then there's both the positive promotion analysis of persistent engagement, as well as critiques of it on Lawfare, which is a blog that's run out of the University of Texas. And so if you go to Lawfare, and plug in persistent engagement, you'll see quite a lot of short articles written for the general policy community that'll give you a bit more on the policy and strategy side. But if I've got the last word, I just want to say it's really been a pleasure to be able to speak to First Special Forces Command audience, and I hope some of the stuff that we threw out today is grist for the mill. Thanks again for the invite.
Thanks to you, Rich, and thanks to Jay as well.
This has been the Indigenous Approach. We hope you have enjoyed this episode. Follow us on social media, and if you have suggestions for topics or guests, send us a message. Thank you for listening.